She was 19 years old, and she had already buried both her parents and watched her family's name stripped from the deed of the only home she had ever slept in. Her father's business partner, a smooth-tongued man named Garrett Cole, had used a forged partnership paper to claim the Whitfield sawmill and the house that came with it the very week her father was laid in the ground, telling the town of Cypress Bend, Louisiana, that 18-year-old Delphine Whitfield had no head for business and no legal claim besides. With the $11.40 that was all she had left in the world, sewn into the lining of her traveling coat, Delphine boarded a riverboat south into the Atchafalaya Basin country and used nearly every cent of it to buy, for $9, a drowned and abandoned rubber plantation house that the jungle had spent a decade swallowing whole, a place the boatmen crossed themselves at and called cursed. It seemed the final proof that grief had finally addled her judgment entirely. But sealed behind a wall no living soul had opened in 10 years, waited something that would not only deliver Delphine Whitfield from ruin, but would return to an entire forgotten community what had been stolen from them in silence. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delphine Whitfield. If you have ever been told that what little you have left is worthless, we hope you'll tell us so in the comments, because we believe forgotten things very often hold more than anyone bothered to look for. Delphine had been raised in a household where her father, Thomas Whitfield, measured the worth of a man not by the shine of his boots, but by the straightness of his word. And it was this single conviction, more than any inheritance of land or lumber, that shaped the whole of who she became. Thomas ran the Whitfield sawmill on the eastern bank of the Atchafalaya, with a fairness that was almost old-fashioned even for 1896, paying his workers, black and white and Acadian alike, the same wage for the same labor at a time when few mill owners in Louisiana would have dreamed of such a thing. And he taught his only daughter from the time she could walk that a ledger kept, honestly, was a kind of sacred document, a promise made visible in ink. Delphine's mother, Marguerite, a quiet woman of Acadian stock, who had grown up along the bayou learning the old ways of healing with roots and barks, and the patient reading of weather and the color of the sky, taught her daughter a different sort of ledger altogether. How to listen to a place, how to read the health of soil and water and green growing things the way her father read numbers, how to notice what others walked past without seeing. It was this pairing of gifts, her father's devotion to fairness and her mother's eye for hidden value, that made Delphine, even as a girl, unusually observant in a household that prized observation above almost every other virtue. She spent her childhood afternoons not with dolls, but tagging behind the mill's old foreman, a formidable and gentle giant of a man named Isaiah Broussard, who had been born into slavery on a plantation not 40 miles from Cypress Bend, and had worked his way, through the sheer stubbornness of his skill, into running the finest sawing operation on that stretch of river. Isaiah taught Delphine to read the grain of wood the way her mother read the sky, showing her how a plank that looked warped and worthless to an untrained eye might, cut correctly along its natural line, yield the finest furniture wood in the parish. And he was fond of telling her, in his slow, deliberate way, that the Lord rarely wasted his materials, only his people's patience to properly examine them. Thomas Whitfield's fairness, however, made him few friends among the other mill owners of the region, chief among his rivals a man named Garrett Cole, who ran a competing operation 12 miles upriver and who resented, with a coldness he concealed beneath an easy southern charm, that Whitfield lumber consistently outsold his own because buyers trusted Thomas's honest grading of his stock. When the two men entered into what seemed, on the surface, a mutually beneficial partnership in the autumn of 1906, pooling resources to bid on a lucrative contract supplying lumber for the new rail spur being built through the parish. Delphine's mother, though she said nothing to her husband, confided to her daughter that she did not trust the warmth in Cole's eyes, that it reminded her of sunlight on water just before a storm. Marguerite Whitfield died of a fever the following spring, and Thomas, already weakened by years of hard work and now hollowed by grief, followed her within 18 months, leaving 19-year-old Delphine alone in the world, with a mill, a house, and a partnership agreement she had never been permitted to read. Her father having always assured her, in the old-fashioned way of protective fathers, that business matters were not a young lady's burden to carry. This single kindness, meant only to shelter her, would prove to be the door through which her ruin walked in. Garrett Cole appeared at the Whitfield house not 4 days after Thomas's funeral, dressed in careful black, his condolences smooth and rehearsed, and it was perhaps 3 weeks later, once the town's sympathy for the grieving young orphan had begun to fade into a more practical curiosity about what would become of the mill, that Cole produced before the parish notary a partnership document bearing what he claimed was Thomas Whitfield's own signature, stipulating that in the event of either partner's death, full ownership of the combined mill operation, including the house and land, would pass entirely to the survivor. Delphine, examining the signature with the same trained eye Isaiah Broussard had taught her to examine wood grain, felt something cold settle in her stomach at the sight of it, certain in her bones that her father's careful hand had never made those particular loops and flourishes. But she was 19, unmarried, without a lawyer, without money to hire one, and without a single document of her own to counter Cole's claim. Since whatever original partnership papers her father had actually signed seemed to have vanished entirely from his strongbox, the parish court, presented with Cole's signed document and no counter-evidence beyond a grieving girl's word, ruled in his favor within the month. Delphine watched from the road, dry-eyed because she had already exhausted every tear she owned, as Cole's family moved their furniture into the house where she had been born, and as the mill workers, Isaiah Broussard among them, were called together and informed that wages would henceforth be adjusted to reflect the current market, a phrase that meant, in practice, that every black worker on the payroll would see their pay cut nearly in half, while the white workers' wages held steady, a cruelty Thomas Whitfield had spent his whole career refusing to permit. Isaiah found Delphine on the road that same evening, pressed $4 into her hand that he could scarcely afford to give, and told her, with tears standing openly in his old eyes, that her father would have been ashamed of what Cole was doing to the men who had built his fortune, and that he was sorrier than he could say that he had no way to stop it. Delphine took Isaiah's $4, added it to the $7.40 she had managed to hide from Cole's notice, and left Cypress Bend the following week aboard a southbound riverboat, having no clear plan beyond simply putting distance between herself and the sight of another family living in her mother's kitchen. It was 3 days downriver, drifting through a stretch of basin country thick with cypress and tupelo, that the boat's captain mentioned, almost as an aside to another passenger, that they were passing what remained of the old Bellerose rubber plantation, abandoned these 10 years since the rubber blight and the death of its owner, a Frenchman named Auguste Bellerose, who had vanished during a hurricane and left no clear air, so that the parish had simply let the jungle reclaim it rather than sort out its tangled ownership. Something in Delphine, perhaps her mother's old instinct for noticing what others overlooked, made her ask the captain to put her ashore at the old landing, and made her walk, alone and half against her own better judgment, up the drowned and overgrown carriage path to see the house for herself. What she found, when she finally hacked her way through vines thick as rope to stand before it, was a wide 2-story house with a collapsed veranda and a roofline sagging dangerously under a decade of unchecked growth, strangler figs wrapped round its columns, its windows staring out blind and green through curtains of moss, and yet, beneath the wreckage, Delphine's trained eye caught the same thing Isaiah had taught her to see in warped lumber: good bones beneath bad weather. A shape worth saving if a person had the patience to look past its ruin. She returned to the landing, found the parish clerk's traveling office set up temporarily at the general store to process the very tax auction that had been quietly scheduled for such abandoned properties, and paid $9, every remaining coin she had in the world, for the house and its overgrown 11 acres. A purchase the clerk himself tried gently to talk her out of, warning her that half the parish believed the place was haunted by Belleros's own restless ghost, still searching, some said, for a fortune he never got the chance to spend. Delphine did not believe in ghosts, not truly. But she believed absolutely in her mother's teaching that a place worth looking at twice was rarely worth what the world assumed at first glance. And so she spent her first weeks at the Belleros house exactly as she had spent her childhood afternoons, patiently, methodically, clearing one room at a time, sleeping on a pallet she'd fashioned from salvaged canvas, eating little, speaking to no one in the nearby settlement of Bayou Perdue, beyond what was necessary to trade her mending skills for cornmeal and salt pork. It was in her third week, working to clear the water-damaged plaster from what had once been a fine upstairs study, that her hand, running along the base of a built-in bookshelf checking for rot, caught on a seam far too straight and deliberate to be the ordinary settling of old wood. She worked at that seam for the better part of 2 evenings with a chisel she had found rusting in the ruined carriage house, until at last a section of shelving, cunningly built to appear solid, swung inward on hinges gone stiff with disuse, revealing not a closet, but a narrow hidden room no larger than a pantry, windowless and thick with the dust of a decade, holding within it a single sealed trunk and, propped against the wall beside it, a rolled canvas that turned out, when Delphine unrolled it with trembling care, to be a detailed hand-drawn map of the plantation grounds, marked in places with small notations in French she could only partly translate. It was, she understood with a chill of recognition, the very first thread of a mystery that would occupy the whole of that long, humid summer, and it was, though she did not yet know it, the beginning of her deliverance. The trunk, once Delphine forced its swollen lock, held a life's worth of careful record-keeping that might have belonged to her own father. So meticulous was its hand, ledger after ledger documenting the operations of the Belleros rubber plantation from its founding in the 1870s through its final failing season, recording not merely the business of rubber, but, page after devoted page, the wages owed to every worker who had cleared the land and tapped the trees, nearly 40 families in all, many of them formerly enslaved people, and their children who had stayed on as free laborers when the plantation converted to paid wages after the war. Auguste Belleros, Delphine came to understand as she read deep into those humid nights by the light of a single tallow candle, had been a man haunted by the moral weight of his own history. A planter's son who had inherited land, worked by enslaved hands, and who had spent the whole of his adult life trying, in his own imperfect way, to settle an account he considered still owed. The final entries in the last ledger, written in a hand grown increasingly urgent, spoke of a great storm gathering, of a payment long overdue finally ready to be made, and of a hiding place prepared where only patience and honest eyes will ever find it should anything happen to him before the debt could be properly discharged. Belleros, it seemed from the fragmented town gossip Delphine gathered carefully over her following weeks in Bayou Perdue, had vanished during the hurricane of 1897, presumed drowned when the storm surge took the old landing dock, his body never recovered. His affairs left in such confusion that the parish, faced with no clear air and a mountain of Belleros's genuine debts to northern investors, had simply declared the estate forfeit and let the jungle do what lawyers could not be bothered to sort out. The workers who had stayed loyal through the plantation's failing years, expecting the wages Belleros's own ledger promised them, had instead been told by the estate's court-appointed administrator, a cold and efficient man named Percival Accord, that no funds existed to pay them, that Belleros's debts to his investors took precedence over any claims by laborers, and that they should count themselves fortunate not to be pursued for the value of tools and equipment they had, in their confusion and desperation, taken with them when the plantation finally closed. The rolled map from the hidden room, once Delphine studied it properly alongside the ledgers, marked a specific location along the bank of a small tributary bayou behind the old drying sheds. Annotated in Belleros's hand with a phrase that took her 3 full days of careful translation to render properly from the antiquated French. Here rests what is owed, that no storm nor scoundrel may claim it before its rightful hands. It was, Delphine understood with mounting excitement, and a grief she had not expected to feel for a stranger dead a decade before she'd ever heard his name. Very likely the location of exactly the payment Belleros had died trying to distribute. Hidden, she guessed, in the frantic days before the storm took him, when he had grown certain, for reasons the ledger did not fully explain, that someone close to him meant to see those wages never paid at all. That someone, Delphine soon came to suspect, was very likely the same Percival Accord who had so efficiently declared the estate penniless. For as she made careful and quiet inquiries in Bayou Perdue over the following weeks, she learned that Accord, far from disappearing after settling Belleros's affairs, had remained in the parish and prospered considerably, purchasing land, marrying well, and eventually becoming the very same parish notary whose office had processed her own house purchase, a coincidence that struck her as far too convenient to be entirely accidental. When she quietly asked the elderly Bayou Perdue shopkeeper, a kind widow named Odile Fontenot, whether she remembered the Belleros workers ever receiving their promised wages, Odile's face had gone carefully blank in the particular way Delphine had learned, from watching her own father's workers, meant a person was frightened to speak plainly. And Odile said only that it was best not to ask too many questions about the old days, and that Mr. Accord did not care for people who stirred up settled business. But settled business, Delphine had learned from her father's own example, was too often simply another name for injustice that had grown comfortable. And she found she could not, having read Belleros's own desperate final wish in his own hand, simply let the matter lie. She began, carefully and without revealing her purpose, to seek out the descendants of the old plantation workers still living in the settlements around Bayou Perdue, finding among them a proud, sharp-eyed woman named Celestine Broussard, no relation she initially realized to her own family's old foreman Isaiah, though the shared name would later strike her as a strange small kindness of fate. Celestine's own grandmother had worked the Belleros drying sheds, and had died still speaking bitterly of wages promised and never paid. A story Celestine had grown up hearing so many times she recited the sum owed, $42, from memory as though it were scripture. When Delphine finally showed her a copy of the relevant ledger page, carefully transcribed so as not to risk the fragile original, Celestine Broussard sat in complete silence for a long moment before asking, in a voice gone rough, whether Delphine meant to actually see it paid, or whether she was only, as so many curious white folks had done before her, satisfying an idle interest in old sorrows. Delphine promised her, with the same certainty her father had once promised fair wages to men the whole parish told him were owed nothing, that she meant to see every family paid exactly what Belleros's ledger recorded, down to the last cent, and it was that promise, quietly made and quietly kept beginning that very week, that turned Celestine Broussard from a skeptical stranger into the first and most valuable ally Delphine would find in all of Bayou Perdue. Word of Delphine's digging, careful as she tried to keep it, did not stay contained for long in a settlement as small and interconnected as Bayou Perdue. And it was perhaps 6 weeks into her residence at the restored house that Percival Accord himself came calling. Immaculately dressed, unfailingly courteous, and utterly transparent in his purpose beneath the charm. Offering to purchase the Bellerose property from her outright for $200, a sum so far beyond what she had paid that it should have seemed a windfall beyond imagining. Framed as generous concern for a young woman's safety, living alone in a property with such an unsettled reputation. Delphine, having by then read enough of Bellerose's own suspicions in his final ledger entries to understand precisely what Accord feared she might uncover, declined his offer with a politeness that cost her considerable effort, and watched something harden behind his carefully pleasant eyes that told her more plainly than any confession that her instincts had been correct from the start. Accord did not accept her refusal gracefully, though he was far too practiced a man to show open hostility. Within days, Delphine found herself informed by the parish assessor that her tax auction purchase of the Bellerose land might be subject to challenge on a technicality regarding proper notice. Found her small trading account at Odile Fontenot's store abruptly and inexplicably closed. Found, most distressingly, that Celestine Broussard's own husband had been quietly informed by his employer, a man beholden to Accord for a mortgage on his own land, that his job would not survive his wife's continued association with the Whitfield girl and her troublemaking. It became clear to Delphine, watching this quiet campaign unfold with the same patient attention her mother had taught her to give a gathering storm, that Accord held enough entangled influence over the notary's office, the bank, and half the parish's livelihoods to make her position genuinely dangerous, and that he intended to see her driven out of Bayou Perdue long before she could gather proof solid enough to trouble him. It was Celestine Broussard in the end who reminded Delphine of something Isaiah Broussard had once told her as a girl, that wood, properly examined, would always reveal the truth of its own grain, no matter how skillfully a dishonest hand tried to disguise the cut. And Delphine realized, turning that old lesson over in her mind through a sleepless night, that a man's handwriting was no different, that Accord's own confident, distinctive script, so carefully practiced in his role as notary, would be impossible for him to fully disguise even in documents he wished to keep hidden. She spent the following days at the parish records office under the pretense of researching her own property's title, comparing Accord's authenticated notary signatures against a faded receipt she found tucked among Bellerose's own papers, a receipt for construction materials that specified, in Accord's own unmistakable hand, though signed with a different name entirely, payment for a concealed storage chamber, upper floor, per instructions of Mr. B. It was proof, circumstantial but damning when laid alongside Bellerose's ledger and his own frightened final entries, that Accord had known of the hidden room's existence and construction, that he had likely been searching for it himself in all the years since, using his position and his careful cultivation of the haunted house rumors to keep curious eyes away from the property while he continued his own quiet search. Armed with the ledgers, the map, Bellerose's letter, and this final piece of damning evidence, Delphine did not attempt to confront Accord alone, understanding as her father had always understood that truth spoken by an unsupported young woman could too easily be dismissed by a smoother, more powerful tongue. She traveled instead to the parish seat and laid the entire matter before Judge Auguste Fontaine, a stern circuit judge with a reputation, rare enough in that place and time, for taking the claims of poor and colored petitioners as seriously as those of wealthy ones, bringing with her not only her documents, but Celestine Broussard and 3 other descendants of Bellerose workers willing to testify to the wages their families had waited a decade to see paid. Judge Fontaine studied the evidence in a silence that stretched long enough to make Delphine's heart pound, before finally declaring that this was a matter he intended to see resolved properly and publicly. The hearing that followed, held on a bright morning in the parish courthouse, was quieter than the gossip of Bayou Perdu might have led one to expect. Conducted with a dignity Delphine suspected her own father would have approved of entirely. When Belleros's ledger was read into the record alongside the construction receipt bearing Accord's disguised hand, and when Celestine Broussard and the other workers' descendants spoke plainly of wages promised and withheld for 10 long years, Accord's carefully cultivated composure finally, visibly, broke. He did not go to prison, for the judge determined that a full decade's obstruction, while morally indefensible, fell outside what the court could easily prosecute as outright theft absent Belleros's own testimony, long since lost to the storm that took him. But Accord was stripped of his notary's commission within the week, forced to return the full value of what he had improperly claimed from the estate's administration, and watched, in the space of a single humiliating season, his carefully built respectability collapse entirely under the weight of the truth he had spent 10 years trying to bury. He left the parish before winter and was never spoken of in Bayou Perdu again, except with open contempt. The hidden strongbox, once Delphine and Celestine finally located and dug it free from the tributary bank exactly where Belleros's map had promised, held not the sum the old ledgers recorded, but considerably more, gold and silver both, accumulated interest of a kind that felt, to those who finally received it, like something closer to justice than mere arithmetic. Delphine kept for herself only the small amount her own labor and expenses over that long summer had genuinely earned. The rest she paid out, family by family, precisely as Belleros's ledger and his own desperate final wish had instructed, watching Celestine Broussard weep openly on receiving the $42 her grandmother had spoken of for a lifetime. Watching elderly men and women who had long since stopped expecting any justice at all hold coin in their trembling hands that had been owed them since before some of their own children were born. What remained after every family's debt was honored, Delphine used not to build herself some private fortune, but to restore the old drying sheds into a communal schoolhouse and gathering hall for the children of Bayou Perdu, black and white and Acadian alike, exactly as her own father had once insisted on fairness that scandalized his rivals, naming the building. Over her own quiet objection and at Celestine's firm insistence, the Belleros Whitfield Commons, so that the tormented planter who had tried, however imperfectly, to settle an old moral debt, and the young woman who finally carried that debt to its completion, might both be remembered for something more than the ruin that had once seemed to define them. And so we return, as we promised at the start, to where this story began, to a 19-year-old girl standing alone at a river, landing with less than $8 to her name, spending nearly every cent of it on a drowned and jungle-swallowed house that an entire parish had already dismissed as cursed and worthless. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for Delphine Whitfield to believe what everyone around her seemed so certain of, that she was finished, that the house was nothing but rot and rumor, that a decade of neglect had erased whatever value it once held. But Delphine had been raised by a father who believed an honest ledger could outlast any liar who tried to burn it, and by a mother who taught her that the world's hasty judgments about what is ruined and what is worth saving are so very often wrong. What she found inside that hidden room was never merely gold. It was a debt a haunted man died trying to pay, a dignity a whole community had been told for 10 years to simply accept the loss of, and proof, quiet but unshakable, that overlooked places and overlooked people, old houses and old ledgers and young women left with nothing but a few coins and their parents' stubborn honesty are so very rarely as worthless as the world, in its haste, declares them to be. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with Delphine Whitfield and the house the jungle tried so hard to keep hidden. If her story moved you, we hope you'll share it with someone who needs reminding that real worth often waits exactly where the world has stopped bothering to look. And we would love to hear your answer to this. What is a time you found genuine value in something everyone else had already written off as ruined? Tell us in the comments below, and until next time, stay close.